Steve A. has the first question. How can we know the difference between unhealthy repression and healthy self-restraint of sexuality? Well, I would say, part of what constitutes ethics, let's say, first of all, let's think about ethics to begin with. So what's the point of conducting your life ethically? The answer to that isn't so that you follow the proper rules precisely. The answer to that is so that you balance your life so that it's as productive and meaningful as it can possibly be. And that would be productive and meaningful for you with any luck, but also for people around you. That would even be better. And for you now and next week and into the future. So it's sort of a variation of the philosopher Immanuel Kant's moral dictum, which was act such that your action becomes a moral universal, something like that. Although I think that it's better phrased across time and across people like that. So when you're thinking about an ethic that has to do with any fundamental motivation like sexuality, you have to think about it in the context of the rest of your life. The question is whether or not, what did I say? What did I read at one point that I really liked with regards to sexuality? Who's in control? That's the issue. Is it you or is it the sexuality that's in control? Have you integrated your sexual life into the rest of your life so that the whole thing makes a harmonious balance? And are you in charge, or is it in charge, so to speak? Because if you're not in charge with that harmonious balance, then things are going to waver wildly out of control and you're going to find yourself in dreadful trouble. That happens whenever any given drive or really any given value predominates to the exclusion of all else. Now, it seems to me that sexuality is best handled within the confines of a relationship. That's the classic ethical solution to the problem. It's because sexuality brings with it a tremendous amount of responsibility. Now, people don't like to think that, especially people who I would say are low in conscientiousness, let's say, or high in impulsivity. It's easy for people to believe in, what would you call it, casual sex, which is not something that I think exists, because I don't think you can divorce sex from its sociological or political or economic or psychological consequences. And I would say the endless scandals that have plagued the United States in particular in the last year with regards to sexual behavior are proof positive that there's no such thing as casual sex. I think the reason for that is that the consequences of sex are too dramatic. It's not just pregnancy and disease, let's say, which are both as dramatic as consequences can be in life, but also the fact that there's no disentangling sexual behavior from emotional behavior. Or maybe you could say even worse, if you try to disentangle your sexual behavior from your emotional behavior, then I think what happens is that you end up cold and cynical. I mean, if you're, let's say, if you're a serial, if you have a lot of one-night stands and a lot of casual partners, then first of all, there's not much discrimination between one partner and the other, and so in some sense you're in a loop and just repeating the same act over and over. But you can't, there's nothing deep about it. There's nothing that enables you to establish a relationship with another person. And I think that I think that you corrupt your soul in that way, and that you hurt yourself across time. And of course, you're going to hurt other people as well. So I'm not a big admirer of the casual sex idea. I think it's a demented adolescence fantasy, fundamentally. It just doesn't work out in the real world. Now, healthy self-restraint, well, with regards to sexuality, it's the same with everything else, is that there's the necessity to forego immediate gratification for the purpose of medium to long-term thriving, let's say. So if your sexuality is integrated in an ethic that encompasses the rest of your life, and if it serves that ethic, then I would say it's properly restrained. If it's unhealthily repressed, well, then you're angry and bitter and resentful and cursing the opposite sex, or perhaps the same sex if you happen to be gay, for failing to recognize your particular form of sexual, what would you call, attractiveness. I think resentment and anger are a good indication that there's something wrong with the manner in which your sexuality is restrained. So I hopefully that's a decent answer. I did a lot of counseling work with people who were, coaching work, I guess, with people who were fairly spectacularly successful, and they were usually workaholics. You know, they're the sort of people that were like, they'd work 80 hours a week, just nonstop. That's just what they were like. And one of the things we were always trying to figure out was, well, how much should you work? Because one answer is you just work till you die, right? I mean, you just exhaust yourself. And, well, that's not a good idea. And then you have to figure out why that isn't a good idea. It's got to be something like this, is that you don't want to do so much work that the amount of work you do interferes with the amount of work that you could still do, right? Because if you work like mad for 2 weeks and then you have to lie in a hospital bed for a month, that obviously isn't very productive. So you have to figure out how much you can work diligently and then how much you have to recuperate so that you can get back up and work again. And, you know, people have basically settled on something like this and given it the divine imprimatur. That's one way of thinking about it, which is, well, you can toil away for 6 days, and no wonder, because you have to work, but you should rest at least 1 day out of 7, because otherwise, well, you don't appreciate life. That might be part of it. And plus, I think it's more a matter of iterability, you know, because one of the things that defines morality is the capacity to repeat something, right? So if something is properly structured in a moral manner, then you can do it over and over and over again without any degeneration. And so that's kind of like a relationship. If your relationship is negotiated, you can continue to negotiate it, and then you can have a relationship that lasts for a long time. You can do it today and next week and next month and next year. You can maintain it across time. And this, I would say, is the wisdom that's been garnered over God only knows what period of time, to say, well, look, I mean, even God needed to take a break and appreciate what was going on, and it's not such a bad thing for people to follow that pattern. And that's a good thing for modern people to know, because we seem to be, even though, you know, we're very wealthy by historical standards, our capacity to relax isn't exactly what it could be, and I think that's really hard on people. Please give your perspective on why polyamory is bad for the individual and society. Well, I think the fundamental reason is, there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, the first is, societies seem to function better, that is, less violently, let's say, when there's one woman per man. If there's many women per man, there aren't many women for every man. There are a handful of men, let's say a minority of men, a Pareto distribution of men who have a disproportionate number of women, and a lot of men who have none. And those aren't happy men, let's put it that way. They're men who are very likely to get up to no good very rapidly. So there's that. Then I would say the women who, let's say a man has many women, and let's say he's a desirable man for that matter, just for the sake of argument, if he has a variety of women, then those women don't have much of him. So they don't get to establish a real individual relationship with him, because it's going to be fragmentary. And I don't believe that that's satisfying for people. I think that what you want, as much as you possibly can, is to have people around you with whom you can weave your life together over the short term, medium term, and long term. It adds depth to your life in a way that almost nothing else can. And so what you do, and so I've been speaking more about permanent polyamorous relationships. You might ask, well, what about sequential ones where, you know, which is in some ways indiscriminable from, from just casual sleeping around. I think the problem with that is that to sleep around casually is to imply that sex is casual. To imply that sex is casual is to assume implicitly that it can be divorced from the rest of life, emotional life, motivational life, values, all of that. And you can divorce it, but you pay a big price for that. I think the price you pay is like the virtual. The the word psychopathic keeps leaping to mind. Leaking to mind. Yeah, good old Freud. You have to reduce a person to the casual pleasure of a transient sexual interaction in order to sleep around casually. And I think that once you establish that as a habit with sex, which is a deep experience, if you'll do that with sex, which is a deep experience, then, and you learn how, then what makes you think that won't transfer to everything else that you do? I don't see how it can fail to. So, you could say, well, monogamy isn't a very good solution. It's like, well, life is a fatal, sexually transmitted disease with a 100% fatality rate too. There's lots of really complex problems for which we only have the best answer we can come up with, which is not a utopian answer, but I would say, and I think the evidence supports this as well, that stable monogamy is the best solution that we know of, and it's also the minimum necessary requirement for the stability of children. So, polyamory, it's wrong. It's wrong. It makes men violent. It increases inequality in the manner that makes things dangerous. It makes it impossible for women to have a deep relationship with men. It facilitates the, the transformation of sex into something casual, and then that spills out into the rest of the world. It deprives the people who engage in it of the opportunity of establishing a stable, long-term, mutually satisfying. It's more than that. Mutually beneficial relationship. Because a good marriage, the people in it gain more than, they're more than twice as good, right? The benefits aren't precisely linear. So you lose that, it destabilizes the situation for children. There you go, man. That's a lot of things that aren't good. That's for sure. There's this idea in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation. And Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be. And that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximal development. Now, it sounds like a metaphysical idea or a mystical idea even, but it's not. It's not. It's a really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, there's nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case? Unless there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that is what the situation would be. It's kind of interesting to think about how that would be manifest moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that lead you down the path of development. Well, that better be the case. Okay, so that's fine. And so there's some utility in pursuing those things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. And the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, what the hell do you know? You might be interested in things that are kind of warped and bent. And often it's the case that when new parts of people manifest themselves and grip their interests, say, they do it very badly and shoddily. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is the precursor to the savior from the symbolic perspectives, because you have to be a fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be a fool, then you can't be a master. So you're going to, it's an error-ridden process. And that's also laid out in the Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens to all these patriarchal figures when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84 is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social and some of it's natural and some of it's a consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So they're fools. But the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're fools, they're still supposed to go on the adventure. And that they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this. So this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely. Highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. And that's the continual message that echoes through these historical stories in Genesis. It's like, these are flawed people. They should have got the hell out of their house way before they did. And they go out and they stumble around in tyranny and famine and self-betrayal and violence. But it's a hell of a lot better than just rotting away at home. And that's great. So that's good. And so why is that? Well, okay, so you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear. There's a great TED Talk, I think it was, about this guy set up a really advanced computational recording system in his home and recorded every single utterance his young child made
while learning to speak. And then he put together the child's attempts to say certain phonemes and put them in a list, and you can hear the child deviating madly to begin with, and then after hundreds and hundreds of repetitions, just zeroing right in on the exact phoneme. So, you might not know this, but when kids babble, because they start babbling when they're quite young, they babble every human phoneme, including all sorts of phonemes that adults can't say. And then they die into their language, so that after they learn, say, English, then there's all sorts of phonemes they can no longer hear or pronounce. But to begin with, it's all there, which is really quite interesting. But so as they learn a particular language, they zero in on the proper way to pronounce that, and their errors minimize. And every time you learn something, that's how it is. And that's really useful to know, too, because it means that it's okay to wander around stupidly before you fix your destination. Now, you see that echoed in Exodus, right? Because what happens is that the Egyptians, or the Hebrews, escape a tyranny, which is kind of whatever you do personally and psychologically when you escape from your previous set of stupidly held and ignorant and stubborn axioms. It's like, away from that tyranny. It's like, great, I freed myself from that. Well, then what? Well, you think, well, now I'm on the way. It's, no, you're not. Now you're in the desert, where you wander around stupidly, and worship the wrong things until you finally organize yourself morally again and head in the proper direction. So that's worth knowing, too, because you think, well, I got rid of a lot of things, excess baggage that I didn't need in my life, and now everything's okay. It's like, no, it's not. You've got rid of a whole set of scaffolds that were keeping you in place, even though they were pathological. And now you have nothing, and nothing actually turns out to be better than something pathological, but you're still stuck with the problem of nothing. And that's exactly why Exodus is structured the way that it is. It's that you escape from a tyranny. It's, hooray, we're no longer slaves. Yeah, well, now you're nihilistic and lost. It's not necessarily an improvement. But it is it's also useful to know that, because you can also be deluded into the idea that, imagine that you're trying to become enlightened, which might mean to turn all those parts of you on that could be turned on. You think, well, that's just a linear pathway uphill. It's just from one success to another. No, it's not. It's like, here you are, and you're not doing too badly, and the first step is a complete bloody catastrophe. It's worse. And then maybe you can pull yourself together, and you hit a new plateau, and then that crumbles and shakes, and bang, it's worse again. And so, because part of the reason that people don't become enlightened is because it's punctuated by intermittent deserts, essentially, by intermittent catastrophes. And if you don't know that, well, then you're basically screwed, because you go ahead on your movement forward and you collapse, and you think, well, that didn't work, I collapsed. It's like, no, that's par for the course. It's not indication that you failed, it's just indication that it's really hard. And that when you learn something, you also unlearn something. And the thing you unlearned is probably useful, and unlearning it actually is painful. Let's say if you have to get out of a bad relationship. It's like there isn't any relationship that's 100% bad. And so when you jump out of it, well, maybe you're in better shape, but you're still lonesome and disoriented, and you don't know what your past was, and you don't know what your present is, and you don't know what your future is. That's why people stay with the devil they know instead of, looking for the devil they don't know. So anyways, the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward. So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful. Okay, so if you were an efficient person, you would have just done that. But you're not. But who cares? You still end up in the same place. And maybe the trip is even more interesting. Who knows? Probably too interesting. Jung. I began to understand that the goal of psychic development, by which he means psychological development or spiritual development, is the self. There's no linear evolution. There's only a circumambulation of the self, a getting closer. It's like you're spiraling into something. Something like that. And the thing that you're spiraling into recedes as you move towards it and gets more and more sophisticated and well developed as you move towards it. Because you're not going to run out of goals, right? No matter how much you have your act together, there's probably, undoubtedly, 30 dimensions along which you could get your act together a lot more. So, and some of those aren't even conceivable to you when you're in your initial uncarved state, let's say.
If a client comes to me and they say they're feeling very sad and down and anxious and worried about everything and so forth, then I kind of walk through their life. Do they have friends? Do they have a family? Do they have a meaningful job? Is their educational background appropriate for their level of intelligence and ability? Are they taking care of themselves? Do they have something to look forward to? Do they use their time outside of work productively and wisely, etc.? So you think about those as the dimensions of a good life. There's more, or maybe there's fewer, but that's not too bad for a quick and dirty first pass through, let's say. Those are the dimensions, by the way, that you work on. If you do the future authoring program in the self-authoring suite, you're asked to think about all those dimensions and consider what your life might be like if you optimized along all of them. And so, if all of those things are going well for you and you feel terrible all the time, then you're depressed. Because there's something wrong with your emotional regulation. I mean, maybe you're having an existential crisis. That's a possibility. But I mean, let's assume we can't see anything structurally wrong with your life, but you're feeling terrible. Then I would say, well, you have depression. There's something wrong. Maybe it's physiological. And people like that, in my experience, those are the people who often really benefit from antidepressants. But then there's the other sort of person who is in trouble. Their educational attainment is not what it should be. They don't have a job. They have an alcohol or drug problem. They have a family that's really not functioning well, or they don't have a family. Their immediate relationship, intimate relationship, is non-existent or terrible. Their friends are non-existent or worthless and destructive. They don't get along with their relatives. They're in poor mental and physical health. You get the picture. And they're not feeling good. Their mood's low and they're anxious. That's not depression. Like it might be, but but what that is a terrible life. And those are different things. They need to be conceptualized differently. Now, even if you have a terrible life, an antidepressant might be able to lift you up enough so that you can keep fighting, let's say, assuming that that's what you're doing. But an antidepressant obviously isn't going to help, isn't going to remove the facts of your terrible life. My wife and I found out earlier in the year we may not be able to have children. Then last month I was diagnosed with cancer. Oh, man. How do I combat depression? Well, the first thing that we should point out here, I'm very sorry to hear about all that. That's a lot of tragedy in a very short period of time, man. And I'm not going to give you any casual advice but maybe I can make some things clearer. The first is you're not depressed. You've had terrible things happen to you. That's not the same thing, right? I distinguish between them. Now, you've got terrible things happening to you at the moment, and there's no simple answer to that. I would say you could take a look at chapter 12 in my book, 12 Rules for Life. It's called Pet a Cat When You Encounter One on the Street, and in part it's an autobiographical chapter about how my wife and I and my family, my son and daughter, and my extended family as well, dealt with my daughter's extremely serious illness. Well, it still plagues her to some degree, although not nearly as much as it did. She was very seriously ill when she was a teenager. And it was an ongoing crisis, continual for years of crisis. And so the question is, how do you cope with that? And the first answer is you shrink your time frame. You've had these especially with regards to your diagnosis. It's like all of a sudden your future has been thrown completely into chaos. And you don't know how to deal with that, and who would. You do what you can to stabilize your medical treatment and to optimize your quality of life while that's happening. A very complicated thing to do. And then I would say you live for the day, for the week maybe. Maybe a week's too much even, but for the day. It's like you get up in the morning, you think, I need to do everything I can to make this day as meaningful and rich as I possibly can. And hopefully I will have had a full day by this evening, and then I'll be able to sleep. And then I'll be able to get up in the morning and say, I'm going to try to make this day as useful and meaningful and engaging as it can be. And then maybe when you're really sick, you don't have a day, you have hours. And then you do the same thing for the hours, and then maybe you do the same thing with the minutes. I would also say, you've been through a lot of shock, and it's conceivable that you might need to talk to someone. It's also conceivable that an antidepressant could help you. You've got a lot to deal with, and your nervous system might need some stabilization with all that stress. And so that's something to consider. Antidepressants are also quite effective as pain medications, especially a drug called Cymbalta. So that's also worth knowing, because you need to know about effective pain medication. It's very important. In extreme situations of pain, opiates, of course, are the drug of choice, but you can use drugs like methylphenidate, the Ritalin, the ADHD drug. You can use them as adjuncts to pain medication, and people need to know that, because they're basically amphetamines. Amphetamines have analgesic properties, but they also they also maintain alertness. And so the problem with opiates is they can be sedating, but an opiate amphetamine combination, and this is for people who are in absolutely intractable pain, by the way, that can increase alertness and help cope with pain. And it's really useful to know what you might need to cope with pain. So I would say shrink your time horizon, and then concentrate on the moment, whatever that moment happens to be. It might be the next minute. I don't know what else to do when you're in an extreme situation. The other thing, I guess the final thing I would say with regards to we may not be able to have children. Well, you need a plan to address that to the best that you can, to the best way that you can. And then you have to give yourself some time to reconceptualize your life and your future. And I would say news like we may not be able to have children, that probably takes about a year or a year and a half to digest. So don't be too hard on yourself if you haven't figured it out yet. It's any major life transformation, like a really major life transformation, I would say takes a minimum of a year to really adapt to. If a client comes to me and they say they're feeling very sad and down and anxious and worried about everything and so forth, then I kind of walk through their life. Do they have friends? Do they have a family? Do they have a meaningful job? Is their educational background appropriate for their level of intelligence and ability? Are they taking care of themselves? Do they have something to look forward to? Do they use their time outside of work productively and wisely, etc.? So you think about those as the dimensions of a good life. There's more, or maybe there's fewer, but that's not too bad for a quick and dirty first pass through, let's say. Those are the dimensions, by the way, that you work on. If you do the future authoring program in the self-authoring suite, you're asked to think about all those dimensions and consider what your life might be like if you optimized along all of them. And so if all of those things are going well for you and you feel terrible all the time, then you're depressed. Because there's something wrong with your emotional regulation. Maybe you're having an existential crisis. That's a possibility. But let's assume we can't see anything structurally wrong with your life, but you're feeling terrible. Then I would say, well, you have depression. There's something wrong. Maybe it's physiological. And people like that, in my experience, those are the people who often really benefit from antidepressants. But then there's the other sort of person who is in trouble. You know, their educational attainment is not what it should be. They don't have a job. They have an alcohol or drug problem. They have a family that's really not functioning well, or they don't have a family. Their immediate relationship, intimate relationship, is non-existent or terrible. Their friends are non-existent or worthless and destructive. They don't get along with their relatives. They're in poor mental and physical health. You get the picture. And they're not feeling good. Their mood's low and they're anxious. That's not depression. Like it might be, you know, but but what that is a terrible life. And those are different things. They need to be conceptualized differently. Now, even if you have a terrible life, an antidepressant might be able to lift you up enough so that you can keep fighting, let's say, assuming that that's what you're doing. But an antidepressant obviously isn't going to help, isn't going to remove the facts of your terrible life. I don't even have the conscientiousness to sit down and do self-authoring. I bought it over a year ago and haven't opened it. What the hell is wrong with me? Well, lots of things probably, because there's lots of things wrong with everybody. But let's not go right for the jugular, you know. Let's assume that the problem is relatively simple before we assume that your character is beyond salvage, which is also something I would recommend if you're arguing with your wife or your husband or your partner, you know. Assume that their character can be salvaged. It's a good way to start the argument. So I would say, why don't you have a smaller goal? You know, so if you notice that you're not doing something, I'm not doing the self-authoring program. Well, maybe it's daunting to you, you know, or maybe you're not very disciplined, or maybe both, or maybe 6 other things. Who knows, right? Maybe you're angry that you spent money on it. There could be any number of reasons. Maybe you don't want a better life. Maybe there are things in your past you don't want to look into. Maybe you're afraid of your personality. Maybe you're terrified of the future and you don't want to think about it. God, any of those things could be true. But what you want to do is first notice that you're not doing it. It's like, oh, I'm not doing this. Well, I must be going about it wrong. Well, it's sort of the definition of wrong, right? If you're trying to do something and you're not doing it, then you're doing it wrong. That's for sure, by your own definition. So let's say, well, if you're trying to do something difficult and you're not doing it, well, you could beat yourself with a stick until you do it, or you could hire someone else to do it, you know, metaphorically speaking, or even maybe really if you want to do it. But barring that, the next best thing is to aim at something lower. Obviously, you're too useless to do the self-authoring program. Okay. Ask yourself, sit on the edge of your bed and say, okay, I think I'd like to try this self-authoring program. Is there some step I could take towards that I would do? I would say, well, maybe you could think, well, what do I have to do it? Well, I have to find my username and password. Then I have to open the web. No, I have to turn on my computer. I have to look in my email. I have to find my username and password. I have to find the site. I have to open the site. Then I have to enter the username and password in. And then I have to start reading it. Okay, so then you think, you got to walk through it like it's a simulation. Which of those things are you unwilling to do? You can ask yourself, am I willing to go turn my computer on? Yes. Am I willing to open my email? Yes. Am I willing to search through my email for the username and password? Well, I'm a bit worried about that because I bought it a year ago. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find the username and password. Okay. Do you think you can handle that potential disappointment and frustration? Yes. I could do that for 10 minutes. Okay, you could always buy it again if you lost it, right? If you really want to do it. It's not that big a deal. Okay, so it looks like I'll turn on the computer. I'll sit down, I'll turn on the computer, open my email. I'll look for the username and password, and I'll buy it if I can't find it. That's a possibility. Will you actually do those things? Like, would you do them right now? Yeah, I think I'd do that. Would you also put the username and password into the program itself? Well, then you feel a little resistance. You think, well, maybe I do that, maybe I wouldn't. Okay, would you put the username and password into the program and start reading? It's like, nope, that's too much. It's like, okay. Then you might think, well, if I wasn't such a useless son of a bitch, I'd just sit down and do the whole thing. It's like, yeah, maybe, but you are exactly that useless kind of son of a bitch. And so you can ask yourself politely what you're willing to do. You might find that you're willing to open the damn program and put the username and password in and like look at the first sentence. And that's a big accomplishment. It's like you could take yourself out for dinner for managing that. And I'm not being cynical. It's like, way to be, you opened it. That means you have to get over your anticipatory anxiety. Like, that's a big deal. Maybe that's enough for the day. If you find that you're not doing something that you know you should be doing, ask yourself, like seriously, like you would ask someone else, like you'd ask someone you care about, like you'd ask someone you'd listen to, what it is that you're willing to do. You won't clean up your room. Okay. Will you clean up your closet? No. Will you look in your closet and like think about some things that you might clean up if you did it the next day? It's like, yes. Well, there you go. Successful negotiation. You know, you're not your own slave and you're not your own tyrant. You have to deal with yourself. You have to negotiate with yourself, just like you'd negotiate with another person. So that means you got to take your stubborn idiocy the way you find it. You got to accept it. And then you have to ask yourself, like you'd ask a really bratty 9-year-old kid, what you might be willing to do to put another foot forward. And then you have to do it. Small as it is. In humility, because you're so damn useless, that was the best you could manage. It's like, well, it's better than nothing. So it's good enough. And if you do that every day, if you try that every day or every second day or once a week for that matter, you know, if you allow yourself to genuinely step forward on a reasonably regular basis, you'll actually move forward. You know, even that will do the trick because the benefits will start to compound. So if you're not hitting what you're aiming at, aim lower, move closer to the target until you can hit it with a little bit of effort, and accept that as your starting point. At least that's good. You found your starting point. Hooray, hooray, you're on the path. Good for you. You know, I'm serious about that.
People are more depressed, more anxious, more suicidal than ever before. Why are so many people depressed?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. You know, like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but like it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it. And every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done and this has to be done and this has to be done. And it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio and I would presume a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. Sure. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. You know, 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work. Yep. So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. You know, well, why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, you know? And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And like, I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, you know, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. You know, and a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that. So I think part of it is the complexity of the modern world.
Yeah.
I also can't shake the sneaking suspicion that it has something to do with our diet.
Really?
Well, you know, I saw this we know that obesity is like skyrocketed.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and probably the reason for that, it's not exactly certain. There might be complicated reasons for it, but certainly one of the reasons is that people eat far too many carbohydrates.
Right.
You know, I saw this video from World War II about and in one of the scenes they showed all these men in New York lining up to be inducted, and it's like, you know, 20 blocks of guys with no shirts on standing in line to be inducted. Every single one of them was bone thin.
Do you
think
it's the insecurity and the negative feelings that come with being overweight, or the actual food?
No. I think there's something wrong with what we're eating.
Interesting.
And, yeah, I mean, there's more and more evidence that dietary sensitivity, for example, is linked to conditions like schizophrenia.
Really?
And so, yes.
Watch out for that bread, y'all.
Well, and also, your gut bacteria, turns out, which you have a lot of, you have about 100 times more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. Which is really quite a freaky thing to think about. Luckily, they're quite tiny, because otherwise you'd be like a giant amoeba.
Yes.
You know, but the gut biome produces a lot of neurochemicals, and so it does play an integral role in the regulation of your mood, which is also a very strange thing.
I've been following that, just how bacteria is starting to play more in human health, like probiotics and stuff like this can regulate your mood. That's so freaky.
Yeah, it is. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, one possibility is that, well, let's say you eat a lot of carbohydrates and sugar. Okay, so what happens is that you grow bacteria in your gut that really like carbohydrates and sugar.
Right.
Well, so then you think, well, I'm always having cravings for carbohydrates and sugar. It's like, you're having the cravings, you think. Well, maybe not. Maybe what's happened is that, you know, through a Darwinian process, you've encouraged the growth of bacteria that really like sugar and carbohydrates.
And you think that same bacteria is messing with people's mood? Maybe.
Yes, and it's also messing with their cravings.
That's.
I mean, we're really walking oceans, you know, like we're big creatures. I mean, we're not big compared to like a Douglas fir or the sun, but we're pretty big creatures, and we are liquid. Most of us is liquid, and you know, if you saturate yourself with carbohydrates and sugar, then you are invaded by the bacteria that live on those things, and so that's not necessarily so good for you. You often give advice to young adults to help them avoid some of the pitfalls of life. Any advice for those of us who are 40 plus who have already faltered? Look, first, Graham, this is Graham. Everybody who is 40 plus has already faltered, but I'm presuming that you mean faltered in a manner that appears to you to be above the average, right? Well, what I would really recommend is, I think that you should, if you haven't already, you should go do the future authoring program and maybe the past authoring program too, because you should figure out exactly how you faltered. Like, what exactly did you do wrong by your own analysis, right? I'm not saying, well, what social rules did you break? Although that's not a bad initial guideline. It's like, so in the self-authoring suite, there's a past authoring module, and it asks you to break your life into 7 epochs, and then to consider the emotionally significant or practically significant events within each epoch, and to detail out their emotional nature and their consequences and so on. And one of the things you might want to figure out is, well, when you say that you faltered, like, what do you mean exactly? And I mean exactly. Go over your life with a fine-tooth comb. This is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn did, by the way, in the Gulag, before he wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He went over his life and said, okay, well, like, where did I go wrong? What did I squander? What mistakes did I make? And what did I do right? So that you can orient yourself now. And then you want to think, and this is why we built the future authoring program, well, look, you got 40 years left, man. So what do you want them to be like? So what do you want to aim at? You know, at least, how are you going to minimize the misery if nothing else? And so you need a plan. And then what you need to do is to figure out how to work day to day so that you incrementally approach that plan. So I have another chapter in this new book called Compare Yourself to Who You Were Yesterday Rather Than to Who Someone Else Is Today. And that's really a useful psychological stance for someone who's 30 and over in particular. 20-year-olds can still kind of compare themselves to other 20-year-olds because all 20-year-olds in some way are the same. But 40-year-olds are really different from each other, and so are 30-year-olds for that matter. So you might think, okay, well, here's a meditative strategy for for ceasing to falter. You could wake up in the morning, or you could do this at night before you go to bed, and you could think, okay, look, I want to structure my day tomorrow so that when I'm done with the day, my life is in slightly better order than it was when I woke up this morning. It's just slightly better, because incremental progress is massively, massively effective, because it bears exponential fruit, just like a bank account. Compounds. Incremental progress compounds with time. So you can get up in the morning and you can think, okay, there's some things in my life that I could put in order today. They're usually things you don't want to do, as I mentioned earlier. What could I do today that would help put my life in order, that I would do? And you have to ask yourself. You can't tell yourself. You have to ask yourself, what would you do? And then maybe you have to say, well, or maybe you have to say, under what conditions would I be willing to do something to put my life in further order today? What little reward would I need to give myself? And these have to be questions. You can't like take out the whip and boss yourself around, because you'll find that you're a terrible master and a worse slave. And so you can get a long ways if you look low enough. One of the things Carl Jung said, which I really liked, was that modern people don't see God because they don't look low enough. They don't have the humility. Now, you said that you have already faltered, so it sounds like you've got the humility already intact. So I would say, think about what you want. Think about what you know around you isn't set right, because you'll know. Make a list of things that around you that aren't right. And then start thinking about small things you can do, like trivial things that even a fool like yourself could manage, that would orient you in the right direction and help straighten out your life. And try that for a year before you decide that you're a failure, because you'll find that if you put that into practice for a year, that things will be a lot better. And like I said, you got 40 years left, so you're not done yet, man. So the other thing I would say too is, it isn't exactly that I would say forgive yourself, because that's just a cliche, but I would say that once you've decided what you've done wrong, and you've put into practice some strategies to rectify that you don't have to beat yourself any more than is necessary for you to learn, which is a good rule of thumb with regards to treating yourself and also to treating other people. I was trying to figure out who I was and how that could be fixed, something like that. I started to pay very careful attention to what I was saying. I don't know if that happened voluntarily or involuntarily, but I could feel a sort of split developing in my psyche. And the split, and I've actually had students tell me the same thing that has happened to them after they've listened to some of the material that I've been describing to all of you. But I split into two, let's say. And one part was let's say the old me that was talking a lot and that liked to argue and that liked ideas. And there was another part that was watching that part, like just with its eyes open and neutrally judging. And the part that was neutrally judging was watching the part that was talking and going, that isn't your idea. You don't really believe that. You don't really know what you're talking about. That isn't true. And I thought, that's really interesting. So now and that was happening to like 95% of what I was saying. And so then I didn't really know what to do. I thought, okay, this is strange. So maybe I've fragmented, and that's just not a good thing at all. I mean, it wasn't like I was hearing voices or anything like that. I mean, it wasn't like that. It was well, people have multiple parts. So then I had this weird conundrum. It was like, well, which of these two things are me? Is it the part that's listening and saying, no, that's rubbish, that's a lie, you're doing that to impress people, you're just trying to win the argument, Was that me, or was the part that was going about my normal verbal business me? And I didn't know, but I decided I would go with the critic. And then what I tried to do, what I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. And now I'm still trying to do that, because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. And I think I really do think the alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come up
They come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. And I learned some of that from reading Carl Rogers, by the way, who's a great clinician, because he talked about mental health in part as the coherence between the spiritual or the abstract and the physical, that the two things were aligned. And there's a lot of idea of alignment in psychoanalytic and clinical thinking. But anyways, I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and I mean, this was over a few months, but it's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that you're mostly dead wood. It's a shock. You know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. Well, so I told you that story as an elaboration of this line. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's a question worth asking. Just exactly what are your motives? Well, you know, maybe they're purer than mine were, and it's certainly possible. I don't think that I'm naturally a particularly good person. I think I have to work at it very, very hard. And I don't necessarily think that everyone is like that. But some people are worse than that. And everyone's like that to some degree. So it's worth thinking about. Just how much trouble are you trying to cause? You know, and the other thing you might think about is that if you're not doing something important with your life, by your own definition, because that's the game that we're playing, you get to define the terms, at least initially. Maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least trouble is more interesting than boring. You know, that's something you learn if you read Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky knew that extraordinarily well. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover, what would you say, willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. And so, also I would say this is also an archetypal scenario. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's something to meditate on. And it's not self-destructive, because what it is an attempt to, it's like the diagnosis of an illness. It's like if that does happen to be the case for you, or to some degree, maybe it's only 10% of you or something, or maybe it's 90%, well then coming to terms with that is excellent, because then maybe you can stop doing it. And what would be the downside to that? You'd have to give up your resentment, obviously, and your hatred and all of that, and that's really annoying, because those emotions are they're easy to engage in, and they're engaging, and they have this feeling of self-righteousness with them, and that goes along with them. But you're not doing this in order to put yourself down. You're doing this in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, and to leave everything that you don't have to be behind.
I mean, let's say if you're a serial, if you have a lot of one-night stands and a lot of casual partners, then first of all, there's not much discrimination between one partner and the other, and so in some sense you're in a loop and just repeating the same act over and over. But there's nothing deep about it. There's nothing that enables you to establish a relationship with another person. And I think I think that you corrupt your soul in that way, and that you hurt yourself across time, and of course you're going to hurt other people as well. So I'm not a big admirer of the casual sex idea. I think it's a demented adolescence fantasy, fundamentally. It just doesn't work out in the real world. Sexuality brings with it a tremendous amount of responsibility. Now, people don't like to think that, especially people who I would say are low in conscientiousness, let's say, or high in impulsivity. It's easy for people to believe in, what would you call it, casual sex, which is not something that I think exists, because I don't think you can divorce sex from its sociological or political or economic or psychological consequences. And I would say the endless scandals that have plagued the United States in particular in the last year with regards to sexual behavior are proof positive that there's no such thing as casual sex. I think the reason for that is that the consequences of sex are too dramatic. It's not just pregnancy and disease, let's say, which are both as dramatic as consequences can be in life, but also the fact that there's no disentangling sexual behavior from emotional behavior. Or maybe you could say even worse, if you try to disentangle your sexual behavior from your emotional behavior, then I think what happens is that you end up cold and cynical. I think the problem with that is that you have to reduce a person to the casual pleasure of a transient sexual interaction in order to sleep around casually. And I think that once you establish that as a habit with sex, which is a deep experience, if you'll do that with sex, which is a deep experience, then, and you learn how, then what makes you think that won't transfer to everything else that you do? I don't see how it can fail to. And are you in charge, or is it in charge, so to speak? Because if you're not in charge with that harmonious balance, then things are going to waver wildly out of control, and you're going to find yourself in dreadful trouble. That happens whenever any given drive or really any given value predominates to the exclusion of all else. Now, it seems to me that sexuality is best handled within the confines of a relationship. That's the classic ethical solution to the problem. Now, healthy self-restraint, well, with regards to sexuality, it's the same with everything else, is that there's the necessity to forego immediate gratification for the purpose of medium to long-term thriving, let's say. So if your sexuality is integrated in an ethic that encompasses the rest of your life, and if it serves that ethic, then I would say it's properly restrained. If it's unhealthily repressed, well, then you're angry and bitter and resentful and cursing the opposite sex, or perhaps the same sex if you happen to be gay, for failing to recognize your particular form of sexual, what would you call, attractiveness. I think resentment and anger are a good indication that there's something wrong with the manner in which your sexuality is restrained. So hopefully that's a decent answer.